It won't take so long. We actually go pretty quick. So before we speak to the SHIELD Act, let's talk about cybersecurity and data protection in general. You probably see it everywhere in the news these days, and there is absolutely no doubt that cyber attacks are on the rise. Anyone having a background in communications knows that there's a strong desire to get PR and media coverage. We love to get any type of coverage, or many of us do, but there's also been a saying that any news, even though we sometimes think it's good news, may not be necessarily as good as we'd like. Especially these days, and especially with headlines like what you see on the slide. I shudder to think if that would happen to any one of us. Those of us with a cybersecurity background, we want to reduce any divulgence of information. Even social media activity is not that much recommended anymore. We call that open source intelligence. It is amazing the details people can get about you just looking at your social media feed. We can basically tell where you had dinner. Today happens to be my son's birthday, just turned 14. I don't dare put that kind of stuff out on any kind of social media anymore, because it could create all sorts of vulnerabilities and issues for him later down the road. So we have to just be careful. Being in the news is just not as good as it used to be. As marketers, we called it free marketing. So why should you care about cyber threats? Well, frankly, everyone, and I mean everyone, that's each and every one of you, me, your family, your friends, your kids, we're all kind of talking about cybersecurity. It's to the point that people are even getting desensitized to the dangers. It's like advertisement. We used to like to send out all sorts of advertisement and people would get interested in it. But these days, a lot of people just tuned it all out. But let me tell you something. When it comes to the dangers of cybersecurity, not only are they real, they continue to grow, and it's exponentially. There are literally people, businesses that are making unbelievable amount of revenue out of stealing, cyber attacks and so forth. Just look at some of the headlines on this slide. Yes, I realize they're a little bit small, but I'm sure you've seen many of them. You definitely probably heard about Yahoo. Many of us use Uber these days, especially, well, it used to be around the holidays, and well, God only knows what we're going to be doing this year on the holidays. Again, wishing everybody safety and health, of course. But that being said, Uber, Equifax, all of these things, it's happening all over the place, these attacks. Like I said, with COVID, it has continued to grow. I happen to love this slide for just the visual. I love bags of money. How many of us enjoy, or basically would love to have that bag of money like that? Definitely me. Notice, I like to look especially at the hundreds. I'm not as enthusiastic about the ones and the fives, but you know what? Just give me those Benjamins. In this case, this money bag could mean very bad things. If you don't protect your business, your customers, even you personally, your data, it really could cost you big. And there's just a few areas that are getting increasingly important to pay attention to. There are more regulations that have been enacted, and given today's economic situation, meaning revenues across a lot of government entities is down, these regulatory agencies are looking for supplemental or alternative revenue sources. And guess what that is? Compliance. There's going to be a lot of resources put to ensuring that companies, like all of ours, are compliant to those regulations, like the SHIELD Act, HIPAA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, that which dramatically expands privacy rights for California residents and more. Now, just because we're talking California or any other state that we are not necessarily living in, if you do business with people across the US, you fall under those acts as well. So it's pretty important. Okay, so let's take a momentary step back. I'll take a few moments to speak about who we are and our experience in the cybersecurity space. I do like to say, yes, we do know our stuff. Let's talk about our speakers and sponsors. ServiceByte has been basically serving the New York tri-state area for over 20 years. You probably know Kish well, yes. So Kish Milani, who serves as the president, has over 20 years of information technology experience. Kish and team specializes in computer support, security, networking, and cloud services. ServiceByte provides IT infrastructure services remotely. These days, we're doing a lot more work remotely, as well as on-site to the New York Metro business. InfoSec Consulting, led by Caleb Christopher. Caleb's motto is, let's have cybersecurity make sense for people. You hear a lot of words out there. People throw that word around a lot about cybersecurity. And sometimes they're not quite meaning the things that are actually really important that they should be referring to. That's why he started InfoSec Consulting. He created a cybersecurity assessment focused on educating decision makers and setting, this is very important, realistic expectations. He then began partnering with MSPs to deliver cybersecurity services directly to end clients. Okay, so let's get to the meat of the discussion of why we're meeting today. What is the SHIELD Act and why is it important? Why is it important to you? You could see the high-level detail on the slide, but in essence, the SHIELD Act provision broadens the scope of consumer privacy. It places strict requirement on protecting personal data for organizations that collect information on New York residents. So whether or not your business is actually based in New York, if you are working with New York residents, New York customers, you fall under this. What does the SHIELD Act stand for? The STOP, oh, gotta love those acronyms. Acronyms drive me crazy. SHIELD Act stands for the Stop Hacks and Improve Electronic Data Security Act, AKA, or also known as the SHIELD Act. It's a New York state bill, and it was signed into law, wow, a year ago in July. So again, the SHIELD Act significantly amends the New York data breach notification law and data protection requirements. Previously, a breach was defined as only unauthorized acquisition of computerized data. So I could tell you, a lot of companies did not want their customers to know that they had experienced any type of breach. With the SHIELD Act, they have to let you know. So let's talk a bit about the breach of a security system. It's a pretty important change here. It basically, the SHIELD Act broadens the phrase, breach of the security of the system. It broadens the circumstances under which notifications are required. So basically, if there's any access to private information, regardless if the access led to the acquisition of the information. So in other words, if somebody snooped into an organization's system and saw the information, that now means this is a breach. The data must have been acquired to constitute a breach. The SHIELD Act keeps intact certain exceptions to the definition of a breach, which includes the good faith employee exception. And it provides factors for determining whether there has been unauthorized access to private information. So this is also important to note. Companies are already subject to the data breach notification requirements under certain applicable state or federal laws. Wow, sounds like heavy duty mumbo jumbo here, but we're talking about HIPAA, probably familiar with it, GLBA, and the NYSDFS Regulation 500. They're not required to further notify affected individuals because under those other acts, you are already under compliance to have to do so. Ooh, my God, sounds real technical, right? I'll kind of try to boil it down a little bit more simple. Yep, I did lose some stuff here. Okay, bear with me a moment here, guys. There we go. Yes, yes, yes. We are missing some stuff here. Yes, so again, to reiterate, the SHIELD Act amends the New York's existing breach notification law. It broadens notification requirements. It requires notification if there's any situation where data has been compromised, also known as a data breach. This slide, if you look at it, it's actually a really nice overview, or as you would say, it's the SHIELD Act in a nutshell. So it's expanded it, it's broadened it, it has updated information, and created data security requirements. Okay, so who must comply? Everyone must comply with this. Smaller businesses do have a little bit of an exception there. When I say smaller businesses, it's businesses less than 50 employees, less than $3 million in gross annual revenue in the last 3 fiscal years, or less than $5 million in year-end total assets. That being said, small businesses must scale their data security requirements according to their size and complexity. And that includes the nature and scope of their business activities and the nature and the sensitivity of the information that they typically collect. So we talked about what it is. Now let's get to what can we do to protect the businesses, to protect our businesses. So you want to have data governance. And that basically entails how is the data going to be managed? You're looking at the sensitivity of the data and any legal requirements. I like to talk about and apply what we call the rule of least privilege. Caleb, would you like to talk to the rule of least privilege for just a moment?
Yeah, least privilege. I used to work at a prison. What's the least privilege you want a prisoner to have? Right? You don't want them getting out of their cell, so they can't have control of their door. What can they have control over? They can have control over their own ID card and the stuff inside their locked cabinet, not anybody else's. And that's the way we treat people on a computer network. Not like they're prisoners, but like that they need to only access the things that they need to access. Should I be able to open the president or the CEO's file cabinet? No, the same thing is true of their files. So it's true that we regulate internal access as well as external, and least privilege means you don't and you can't see things that you shouldn't see. And when we set up a system properly, then you don't accidentally see stuff you're not supposed to.
Thank you so much, Caleb. And didn't you appreciate how I threw that at you? You picked it up like that. Great job. Awesome. Encryption, protecting against things like the man-in-the-middle attacks, leveraging SSL certificates. We can't stress enough education and training. Train, train, train. Testing, test your organization's data security by sending fake spear phishing campaigns. Want to have an incident response plan, data backup and recovery, security deletion, third-party and fourth-party vendor monitoring, as well as accident, data exposure, and leaked credential monitoring. My personal recommendation, and I think Caleb would agree, is you do, no matter the size of your company, those are just best practices. You want to have data governance, you want to have encryption, you want to have education and training, you want to do testing, you want to do incident response plan, you want to have data backup and recovery, as well as secure deletion. And by the way, I just left that up intentionally because I wanted that to kind of sink in. Like I said before, failure to implement a compliant information security program that's enforced by the New York State Attorney General can cost super big time. There can, and as I said, there probably will be penalties at this point because they're really trying to enforce compliance. And you're talking $5,000 per violation or up to $250,000. Ouch. The specific, yes, absolutely, Caleb.
I just want to break down a couple of those technical things. When you say data governance, encryption, education and training, testing, that's a big list of stuff. Incident response plan. These are things that are needed. They're best practices and they're needed. But from if I'm on the other side of the screen watching this, I'm like, okay, what does all this stuff mean and how do I do it? Where do I even get started? But like, for example, testing, when you said phishing, why should we be doing testing? Not just because it's a law, but why should we be doing testing anyway? How do we test people with security?
Great, Caleb. You want to answer that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can answer my own question.
You let it. Here you go.
I
can answer it, but I don't want all the spotlight.
Yeah, it's important to test people because especially in healthcare, which is one of the verticals that we're talking to. But people are the greatest vulnerability to a company. People misconfigure systems. People send out emails with financial data they weren't supposed to. People are the ones who click links. And so why wouldn't you put your security to the test? If people get vulnerability assessments or penetration testing, or they assess the effectiveness of technical security controls, and people are still the greatest risk, why wouldn't you test people? So yes, there's a whole list of section titles of you have to do this thing, this thing, this thing, and this thing. But we can break it down into a list of what's appropriate for your business to accomplish those goals. So I just want to make sure people don't get overwhelmed with, okay, there's a giant list of stuff that I don't understand. If you got questions, write them down, because we'll be able to answer them, whether on the call or later. Okay, guys.
Thank you so much, Caleb. Absolutely. Well said. Okay, so back to the scary part about the penalties. I just wanted to get to the legal speak of the SHIELD Act as they have specifically listed it. So yeah, sorry, I'm going to put you back to sleep for a few minutes. Businesses that fail to comply with the breach notification requirements can be held liable for the actual cost or losses incurred by a person entitled to notice. In addition, if the business violates the provisions knowingly or recklessly, a civil penalty of the greater of $5,000 or $20 per instance of failed notification, up to a maximum of $250,000. So like I said, with economic conditions as they are and revenue draining up in a lot of the municipalities, the governmental agencies and so forth, they're looking for new revenue sources. So there's increased focus on finding ways to generate revenue. Enforcing compliance is very much hot on the radar. So a little bit of more specifics. SHIELD Act, how do they define what is personal information? So this is how they define personal information. Pretty kind of self-explanatory. I like my, again, acronyms are kind of bad, but PII is very commonly known from the cybersecurity space. Private information is any personally identifiable information, we call it PII, such as name, number, or other identifier coupled or joined with social security numbers, driver's license numbers, or non-driver identification card numbers, account numbers, credit card, debit card, bank information, passwords, et cetera, et cetera. Private information can also include biometric information such as your fingerprint, voice print, retina or iris image, or other unique physical representation or digital representation of biometric data.
I just read an article about how virtual reality headsets that track your movement can be used to identify you. So they can identify who's playing a game by the way you wear the headset. That's biometric data. That's PII. That's crazy.
That is crazy. Wow. Yep.
Sorry.
No.
It's really fascinating.
This is, you know, we're
does
literally.
Does anybody produce virtual reality games here?
It's real-time stuff.
Yeah, and that's why this stuff is changing all the time.
Yeah.
We have to stay on top of it and constantly assess.
So true. So let's recap or reinforce the really important points. Just about every business, and by the way, look at this from your personal perspective as well. Most businesses are conducting transactions that will involve capturing data points like customer, your information, your PII, or you're collecting your customer's PII. From a cybersecurity perspective, it is in your organization's best interest in creating a PII protection policy, amongst other things you want to focus on. We're going to cover a couple other best practices in the next few slides. And by the way, so you as a consumer, take a look at it also this way. When you're doing business with companies, ask them what they got going on, you know? How are they protecting you? So to protect and defend your company, your clients, even your personal data, you want to have what we lovingly say in cybersecurity, a defense in depth or security in layers approach. We cover this also in other webcasts, which hopefully, if you're available, join us for other ones as well. But a high-level overview, this is a really good graphic that speaks to it. Several measures put in place can really help. This slide talks about technology you should consider if you don't have it already implemented, and Kish certainly can help you get all that stuff set up. So you want to make sure that you have your physical, your perimeter, your network, your host, your application, your data, all protected. And we talk about the technology up above. As Caleb said earlier, that rule of least privilege. Who has access to what? That rule of least privilege is Security 101. That means don't give anyone access to everything. For those of you who have kids, hopefully they don't have access to your bank account, right? If my 11-year-old girl did, oh dear Lord, I would be living in a box, truly. I joke with her all the time that she will send me to the poorhouse. I love that girl, but she can truly spend. She has literally 50 pairs of shoes or more. Okay, maybe I exaggerate a little. I was on a trip a few months back, and she took advantage of my Kindle and just downloaded boatloads of movies and stuff like that. I had a $300 bill. So yes, rules of least privilege, especially with kids. And let me tell you, employees as well, from a data perspective, remember the rule of least privilege. Any user, program, or process should have only bare minimum privileges. So users don't have them, as I say, don't give them the keys to the kingdom. So security is also very much about storage. ServiceByte's Kish Milwani, would you please speak to this very important area?
Yes, I can. Can I, not if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Tanya. So I figure I'd talk about each of these a little bit more in depth, but also give some real world examples. I know that this could be a little bit of a dry subject with security and compliance being, not necessarily top of mind for all of us, but I figure real world examples would help here. So when we talk about transmission security, for instance, what that means is any data that is being transmitted on the network needs to be secure. And a good example of this is email security. A lot of folks don't realize that when you're using email, the person that you're sending email to may or may not be receiving that information securely. So by using encrypted email, what you do is you enforce that email to be transmitted securely. So that's a good example of a transmission security. Another example would be access controls, where you want to have policies and procedures with rules of how data should be accessed. So a good example of this is what's happening right now in this year with the pandemic. A lot of us are working remotely. So you want to make sure that when you're working on sensitive information that you're doing it in a safe way. That may mean making sure that you use a computer with a VPN secure connection, or making sure that you're remoting in from a work computer to a work computer, not from a personal computer to a work computer, and putting certain information at risk. Integrity controls really talks about having policies and procedures and tools that prevent manipulation or destruction of data. So a good example of this is that, for years we use a workstation to store sensitive information at our offices. And at some point, those computers get replaced. What do you do with the old computers? How do you discard them? So we make sure that you have policies and procedures that state how they should be properly discarded so that you're not putting your data out there for somebody to discover. Audit control is basically setting up systems that can log and analyze access by users. So for instance, if you lose sensitive information, you want to really be able to know who did what. That's the whole idea behind this. You don't want to say, for instance, I've seen people share a single Dropbox account between multiple people. And a danger to that is that what if one of those people destroys the data? You wouldn't be able to tell because everyone is using the same login credentials. So they're all essentially the same person, and you wouldn't be able to identify who that is. And then you have some physical safeguards. We talk about putting locks on computers, but also let's talk about additional types of security protection. So for instance, workstation and device protections, having policies and procedures on how electronic media is moved, reused, decommissioned, discarded, very similar to what we had earlier with integrity controls. You want to make sure that you know, as an example, throwing away a workstation, what do you do with that data? How do you make sure it's physically safeguarded? Facility access is an important one as well. You want to make sure that if you are kind enough to put in or careful enough to put in a password on your computer, are you protecting those who are around you from just coming into your office and just accessing that computer, grabbing it and going? You want to make sure that there's some facility protection as well, limit physical access to authorized parties. Administrative safeguards, a good example of this is an assessment here, routinely evaluating the extent to which policies and procedures are aligned with the security rule. So for instance, your business changes every day and things around you are changing. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing are really standing the test of time by reassessing. And depending on the size of your organization, even smaller organizations, you want to have a security point person, somebody that you designate as a security officer within your organization who creates and manages policy and procedure documents. That's their role, and they're going to always keep that top of mind. Staff management and training. This is something that I found kind of amusing over the past few years. You want to make sure that all members of your team should have security training. And there must be consequences when anyone disregards the official guidelines. So, the example I give here is that if you want to work in the construction industry and operate a crane, you have to go through pretty extensive safety training, because if you make a mistake there, you could be putting lives at risk. Yet we have computers that can take over countries and political systems that are just being used casually without any training. So we want to make sure that people within organizations can identify the threats that are out there, especially if they're just simple things that come as an email, for instance, that if you click on a link that can cause damage to your computer or your entire organization's environment. Data access management. You only want to allow an individual to access data when their role gives them that permission. This is called role-based access. So for instance, you want to keep employee and management's information separate, or at least restricted to the levels that they're allowed to have. Employees should not have access to managers' data because that's not something that they need access to. So segmentation really helps quite a bit. Security management is a company must identify risks and take steps to mitigate them. This is at the core of it, just a simple thing. You want to be able to always identify these, and you don't want to mitigate those risks too late, because it's too late. You don't want to cause damage to your company. Risk analysis, reporting and management. All storage should be assessed for any risks on a regular basis. Here's how this works. Assess risks to the data, potential results of the related attacks, and how likely they are to occur. Set up security protections against the risks discovered. Record the security steps that are taken and why they were taken, and set up and support ongoing appropriate and reasonable safeguards. Reporting on safeguard success or breaches, because as time goes on, as we had mentioned before, things change. You want to make sure that the same types of rules that you've implemented stand the test of time. So that's an important thing. And Tanya, I think we can go to the next slide. Thank you. And I hope everyone's awake. All right, good. I see some people on screen. All right, good. So just to wrap up here, a few more things. Geographic separation plays an important role here. Many regulations point toward your data needing to be stored in a completely separate geographic location than where your primary data is stored, to ensure that data is available in case of an emergency. So example of this would be putting your data in the cloud. In the event something goes wrong with, say, your office, electrical damage, let's say a COVID infection, and you need to leave on short notice, you can still access your data from the cloud and be able to continue to operate your business. Data restoration. You also need access to your data for quick restoration and business continuity purposes. So what does it mean when data restoration needs to meet your RTO? So RTO, by the way, stands for Recovery Time Objective. And Caleb, I think I just got 10 points for just remembering that. What that really means is, thank you. What that means is that in the event something goes wrong, how long is it acceptable for you to restore your data. So of course, everyone's going to say 5 minutes, but what does that cost? Sometimes to be able to restore your data within 5 minutes could cost several hundreds of dollars every month. And for that possibility that you might need to do that. So it's important to keep this in mind, what is reasonable within your budget, but also what does your business need in order to maintain its critical operations in the event of a situation that causes a continuity issue. So do you want to wait 1 day or do you want to wait 1 week for your data to be restored? These are good things to assess, and this is something that Caleb specializes in assessing and helping you with. But it all comes down to what you feel is acceptable. Frequent retention points. Your backups need to have frequent retention points to mitigate any data loss if downtime occurs. So a good example of this is in the event you get a ransomware infection, which can encrypt all your files against you. That means that when you go to your documents folder, you will not be able to access any of your files. So do you want to restore at a certain time that was safe? When was that certain time that was safe? Was it at 3 p.m. when the virus struck and all your files are encrypted? Well, that's not a safe time. You want to go back to 2 p.m. or 1 p.m. or 2 a.m. the day before. So you want to be able to have those various points at your disposal in the event that you need to recover maximum amount of data that is safe to recover. Let's see here. And last one I want to actually talk about was frequent testing. You want to make sure that one final and sometimes overlooked requirement is organizations need to test their policies, procedures, and processes, and data continuity, of course, on a frequent basis to ensure their data is protected. So this is an important thing. You know, a lot of us, we back up our data, but how well do we know how easily it's recoverable? How well do we test these threats that are out there? You know, let's put ourselves in these hypothetical scenarios where something goes wrong. How do we react? What do we do? That's where frequent testing really comes in. And Caleb, I'll let you take over from now. Thank you so much.
Question. Oh, okay. Question from the peanut gallery. Really, this question was for you. Well, it's kind of a, here's one. Is a backup really a backup if it's not tested?
No.
That's just something to think about, right? Like, you have to be testing your backups and doing test restores, at least periodically. It's not that every single one needs to be tested, but you need to know if there's any errors with your data, because if that data is critical, it's critical that it works, and a backup's not a backup unless it's tested. But what he was talking about with the testing was what we call tabletop exercises, where you can simply sit down with your team and run a verbal scenario where someone like Kish or I is like, okay, you just got hit with ransomware. What are you doing? Who are you calling? And you have to go through an exercise just verbally, whether you've got your policies and procedures in front of you or you're just playing it by ear. It's a good practice to run through and understand what the potential impacts are. What if somebody's on vacation, right? You don't write somebody being on vacation into your incident response plan, but that's the sort of stuff that happens. What about when it's on a holiday weekend? I went through a breach with a company who got a hack on Friday evening on a 3-day weekend, or a Thursday evening on a 3-day weekend. That was no fun at all. Was this my slide, by the way?
I believe so.
Or Tanya?
It's up to you. If you want to take the recaps, absolutely.
Yeah, I'll take this. So here's the big deal, guys. You have to protect customer data. Not only should you from a moral perspective, but now it's also mandated by law. It doesn't matter where you are geographically located. New York is taking the lead on this to make sure that their citizens' data is protected. And I, as an individual, appreciate that. I understand how it's kind of a pain on the business side that now we have to pick up some new practices and do stuff. It's the stuff you should have been doing anyway, though. And the minimum fine is $5,000 on this if you're failing to follow through with what they're saying, or it adds up pretty quick after that based on the number of records that were breached. But you can't protect what you're not aware about, right? If we're going to say you need to protect data, then you need to be able to detect when the protection fails, and you need to be able to respond when the protection fails as well. But you can't respond unless you've detected the problem. So one of the ways we do that is with cybersecurity assessments. You need to understand what your risks are, both business and technical risks. Technology is just a different way to introduce business risk. I say there's really nothing different between cyber risk and business risk. They're both risk. It's just where are they coming from? So you have to be doing assessments, having other people come in and look at what you're doing and how you're doing it to see Do they see a risk that you didn't see? It's all about that perspective. And I'm going to hit back on that training again. You have to be fish training your users. They are the most vulnerable component of any organization. And if it's going to cost you $5,000 to fail minimum, which it's likely to cost quite a bit more than that, then how much is it worth to be testing employees and disciplining those who constantly fail? How much of a risk is that person to your business? Are they worth, I keep saying 5,000. It's going to cost you more than 5,000. Is that employee, is being nice to that employee and not disciplining them for failing security tests worth that? And then you have to secure your networks. You have to know where your data is. And again, you can delegate almost all of this stuff, but you need to know somehow where your data is and how it's being handled. And we don't want to give access to the wrong people. So we need to be careful in how we structure access permissions and systems, and what apps and services we're using. How many of you, I mean, you don't need to raise your hands or anything, but I know we all do this. I use Google Chrome, you use whatever you want. We get extensions and add-ons to our browsers, and those browsers, those extensions, when we get them, how many of us actually read what it's going to do? Oh, this app gets to access your data. Okay, does that mean my company data is on this web browser that now this application can access? How many of your salespeople are doing that? They're clicking yes, okay, continue, next. Every time they want some convenient add-on, have they given away access to your company's data? Is that a breach? It's hard to tell without actually looking directly, but these are the things that we have to consider, and that's what an evaluation does. Train those users and test them. That's it for me on this slide, Tanya.
Yep. So Caleb, you actually talked about the cybersecurity key takeaways, and you also talked about the Shield key takeaways. So do you want to talk a little bit more to this? Otherwise, we can open it up pretty much to questions. But you did already talk about it.
I know.
All right, then.
I think we got it.
I think we got it. Good. Very good. Okay. So I'm going to go, obviously we're going to go to the questions, but what I will do is I'll go ahead and leave up the contact information here, and we'll go ahead and open it up to questions.
And you guys, you should be able to unmute yourselves or drop in the chat. I'm going to put a chat message out there. Feel free to ask questions here. That way, if we don't have time to talk about one or whatnot, then we can always hit you up after the fact. Does anybody have questions?
I guess you could speak a little more to the backup testing.
Yeah.
That is something, you know, I don't know that we're fully doing that, Kish, or, you know, do we started looking at that, and I don't know that gone as far as we should on that. What would that entail?
Great question. So Dan, perfect example for instance, your server. There's a new type of backup that we can use. I mean, new as in over the past few years, it's developed, called a BDR, a business disaster recovery solution, where instead of just backing up your files and your server to a local disk and offsiting it, there's a service called Datto, as an example, that will actually image that server and the backups that go into their facility in Connecticut, by the way, they will actually do a test restore every night where they will turn on that server, take a screenshot of it, and send it to our team to review every night. So this way we know with confidence that in the event something goes wrong, is that backup a viable backup that we can restore?
When they're test restoring it to some other server, I assume.
Correct. What they do is they virtualize your backup. They store it inside of a contained environment. That's how servers have the ability now to have multiple servers within them. So what they do is they virtualize it and they turn it on, and they bring it to a login screen. That's all they can do. Mm-hmm. Once that is possible, you know that the backup is a viable backup and we can restore from.
Yeah, the system's fully functional. And one of the other benefits of the backup and disaster recovery service, there's a ton of different plans, so I'm not telling you which one you're on, is that if your physical site has an issue, or wherever that server physically is, if that has a major issue, then the test restore can be restored in a cloud environment. Cloud just means somebody else's computer, by the way. So usually a cloud is a cluster of servers in a warehouse. then your server can be restored and still be accessible and usable, even if your site gets, I'm in Kansas, so we have tornadoes, but if there's a flood, tsunami, whatever goes on, it's safely restored elsewhere and business can continue.
Yep.
Good question.
Dan, we'll continue our chat on that.
Yeah.
Offline. I know we have a conversation later this week.
Good.
Yeah, that was a real good question. And that also speaks to, guys, think of questions, but that also speaks to recovery time objective. How fast do you want to be able to get back online?
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's something else called recovery point objective. So how long ago is the most recent backup? So if that's a nightly backup, then your recovery point is anywhere between 1 and 24 hours, right? If it's a single backup every day, then the maximum amount of time you're going to lose if you had to restore back, like if you got ransomware and you had to go to a backup, then you can lose up to 24 hours worth of data. And that's your recovery point objective. And then how long does it take to come back online? That's your recovery time objective. So you could have a 24-hour recovery point with a 1-hour recovery time. And that means if at 8 a.m. you get ransomware, you could be restored to a cloud workload or local workload in less than an hour as of, and restore your computers to midnight or whatever time that backup happened. So there's two important metrics to understand.
I assume there are both sort of typical industry standard times, but also you have to relate it to your operations and say, what can I bear?
Yeah, if you're processing financial transactions, your recovery point and time objective are 0. That means you have to have live redundant systems, more than just 2, right? So that's really expensive. Everybody likes to say, oh, I don't want it to take any time, or 30 minutes. I can't be down for more than 30 minutes. Okay, so let me do the math here in my head. If it's going to cost you $70,000 a year to be able to restore in less than 30 minutes, is that okay? Okay, let's adjust our pricing, right? So it depends upon you, what you need, and how time sensitive that data is, and what that data is.
And being told there'll be some test afterward on all the lingo we're using, RTO, RPO.
Exciting. Hey, guys, do you have to? I may have missed this at the beginning with the Shield Act. Do the companies have to self-certify? Is that how this works in New York? That they, or is this only if something happens that it becomes an issue?
Yeah, it's like that. From what I'm understanding, if there's a problem and they look and you were non-compliant, then it's deemed that you get fined, right? It's not that there's a certification or an audit that you can publish the certification for.
Okay.
And say, hey, we're compliant. It's going to be, if you're compliant, then this stuff shouldn't be happening to you. And if something does happen to you, like a breach, then they're going to look and see were you compliant or not for real.
And while it seems like, hey, I might not have to do this, or this is something that is a nice to have, realize that other states and locations are starting to do this as well. EU did this with GDPR. Some are enforcing, some are really pushing for certain higher, they're raising the bar, but it's only a matter of time before all states, or even at a federal level, this is going to be an important factor to consider.
It's best business practice regardless of the state or what the requirement is to protect your business.
Right. At the core of it, you're making these investments and decisions to help protect your business.
I think the comment about the browser extensions potentially being access points is, something that not everyone is aware of, and it's certainly something I can imagine, like in our training series, we should be including. It's something I want to look at. If it can be defined as a breach and a violation, then I think we need to go back and see how we're managing that. That's kind of I'm aware of it. You get these reminders when the extension gets installed and it says we're going to access your contacts or something, that this is going on. But I think.
But sometimes that feels like a quiz to see how fast you can click continue, right?
Yeah.
Dan, I just noted that down. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, let's look at that. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions, guys?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Kish, Carl Benevento of Cyberstone. Caleb, great presentation. Kish, great. Thank you very much. This was informative. I think what I personally feel, and from talking with people at the state of New York, when the Department of Financial Services came out with 23 NYCRR 500, or the regulation on the insurance company, you know, it was a push pretty hard. But if you go up on the DFS website now, you're going to see a link for enforcement. And I think what's going to happen, or my feeling is with this, is next year, you're going to see that up on the Attorney General's page too as well. I think as
That's a good comment.
breaches occur, right, they're going to start to publicly, I'm not going to say shame, but they're—
No, well, that's what they call it, the HIPAA wall of shame, isn't it?
Yeah,
they call it the HIPAA wall of shame. So there's an enforcement page for the same thing. Go ahead, sorry.
With DFS. So I'm assuming that probably the same thing's going to happen here with the SHIELD Act. I don't know if COVID has slowed things down this year on it, but yeah, it is an absolute concern. And it's just a matter of just companies showing due diligence and putting those things in place to keep their client information and their own information safe, right?
I think, and Tanya had an interesting perspective on COVID causing higher enforcement.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's definitely going to come. Yeah. I'm very, very, very sure about that.
Yeah. I'm looking at that now. If you guys, by the way, if you guys haven't seen the HIPAA wall of shame, you can look it up, but it just shows all the breaches, the healthcare breaches. And what he's saying is that there's a decent likelihood, since the Department of Financial Services regulation has already started their own, basically a wall of shame, then there's a good chance New York is going to do the same thing with New York SHIELD violations. So you don't want to be on that wall of shame. When somebody Googles your company name, are they going to see it on that wall of shame for breaches?
Yeah, and the fact too, what is it with the election too now? Prop 24 passed out in California, so the California Consumer Protection Act is absolutely going to be in full swing. And if you do have clients, obviously, or you have business that's done out in California, you may be subject to audit and questionnaire next year in terms of what you're doing with that particular California entity's client information.
Right. What we're seeing here is really, and what we're talking about is really the beginnings of what's happened over the past few decades with certain other organizations that have come out. For instance, in the Food and Drug Administration, you have a case where you have enough people that are being affected by drugs that are not being properly moderated or protected, going through their trial and error phase, or food that's being put out that may be harming us. So you have organizations at the government level coming out and saying, hey, we want to set this bar right. And at some point, as more breaches and security incidents occur that result in harm to the general public, the more likely that we're going to have more guidelines along this that are going to be a bit more stringent or going to be enforceable. So to kind of get on this bandwagon early is important, because it'll put you in the right direction to make sure that security and your safety is top of mind for you and your clients.
And we had another question come in about the Chrome extensions. So when I gave that example, Mary asked the question, when you do add-ons. So there are apps and services. I use G Suite personally, or Google Workspace as it's now called, but there are online extensions for all the browsers and apps. So there's what you see as a third party, a company that's not yours, has then access to either your browser or the data on a page or something along those lines. But if I use an add-in for Google Drive or my storage, or for example, OneDrive, if it's on the Microsoft ecosystem, and I have an add-on that helps me with some feature that I really wanted, like I can see maybe how many times a specific user has opened a file and what time. So if there was an extension, for example, that does that for a shared file, then that extension requires access to the file, right? So if that file has confidential information, then that third party then has at least direct access to the file. Do their users have access to the file? Probably not. But have I just entrusted a third party that I've never either never heard of until I Googled that Chrome extension, right? Or something along those lines, that I have not tested the company or don't know who they really are. Have I just granted them access to at least some of my data? Yes.
How about?
So that's how that works. And that's true of calendar events too. So if your calendar events contain confidential information, then you need to vet every calendar extension app that you've got for your account.
How about the third-party applications that say use the Google authentication infrastructure to, as a authentication for their systems? Is that necessarily?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what he's talking about is like if I choose if I go to a website and I choose sign in with Facebook or sign in with Google, what they're doing is instead of me creating a username and password for their site, so site A, I go log in. I don't know if you guys can see me. I'm using hand motions, but at site A, I go to log in and create an account. I'm going to use my Google sign in because then I don't have to create a new username and password. What that does is it does not grant that site access to my Google account. What it does is refer authentication. It creates a username for me on their back end, but and then it ties that username to a Google account. So when I go to log in, it says, hey, who are you and how do you want to sign in? I say sign in with Google. It says, oh, okay, you're Caleb Christopher. Hold on, let me check with Google and see if that's you. And then it pops me out to a separate page and I click which account to sign in with. And then Google authenticates me. And I've got two-factor authentication on my Google account. So it's a really secure authentication. And then, or Facebook, whichever one you choose, right? Or Office 365. And that says, back to the first website, it says, hey, we already checked this person. Yes, they are who they say they are. Go ahead and let them sign in. So it doesn't necessarily grant access to your data. It just entrusts the authentication to a third party, which is probably a stronger third party than somebody running a WordPress website.
So it's generally, that's not something to be afraid of. Then.
I would not be concerned about sign in with Google or sign in with Office 365.
They're just sending back some sort of a token or something saying, yep, they're good.
Yep, it's just that website entrusting a third party that you trust to prove who you say you are when you're trying to log in. And I would say from a security culture standpoint, it does improve security. So it's kind of like single sign-on, but it reduces the number of usernames and passwords you have to remember and centrally locates all the login data to that one authentication account.
Good.
Well, we're coming up on the end of the hour. Any last minute questions? We're going to wrap it up otherwise.
That was good. Thank you.
Like everyone's still awake.
Well, they stuck around at least. Guys, we hope this has been helpful for you. If you have questions that you didn't want to ask here, feel free to reach out to Kish or me directly. Got our information on screen there. We're happy to answer questions. But this stuff it's going to happen. People are going to start getting enforcement actions on this stuff, and it's going to hurt. And there's some fairly simple things you can do to significantly reduce your risk of not only just a breach, but also an enforcement action after the fact.
Good. Thank you. This was good.